The stars had seen 1,000 civilizations rise. They had watched empires burn, alliances crumble, and species vanish into the cold silence between galaxies. The stars, in their ancient indifference, had never once been surprised. Until humanity learned to fly. It began with a probe, a small, elegant thing, silver and humming with the Galactic Concorde's diplomatic frequencies. The Concorde had sent thousands like it over the centuries. It was routine. A new civilization had been detected clawing its way out of a backwater spiral arm, and protocol demanded acknowledgement before they accidentally stumbled into something they couldn't handle. The probe reached the Sol system's outer edge on a Tuesday. By Thursday, it had company. 400 warships emerged from the dark like ghosts, not in formation, not the clean, ceremonial V-shapes the Concorde used for diplomatic greetings. These ships came in clusters, the way survivors come home. Their hulls were scorched black in long streaks. Sensor arrays were patched with mismatched plating. One cruiser near the back was still venting a faint trail of coolant vapor, frozen instantly into a glittering ribbon behind it. These were not parade ships. These were working ships, ships that had been somewhere terrible and come back anyway. Inside the lead vessel, the CNS Resolute, Admiral Yara Chen floated in her command chair with one boot off, rubbing a blister on her left heel with the practiced ease of someone who had long since stopped caring about appearances. She was 47. She had 17 battle commendations, a titanium replacement for her right collarbone, and a reputation among the Kreth, humanity's recently defeated enemies, that translated roughly into their language as the one who does not stop. She looked at the Concorde probe on her main screen and smiled. "Open a channel," she said. Her communications officer, a young man named Petrov who still got nervous during first contacts, swallowed hard and opened the channel. "This is Admiral Yara Chen of the Consolidated Human Navy," she said pleasantly, "representing the Terran Allied Systems. Welcome to our neighborhood. We'd offer you a tour, but we've been a little busy lately." As she spoke, a piece of debris drifted past her viewport, the shattered forward plate of a Kreth Dominion flagship, still bearing their command sigil, now cold and dead as its former owners. She didn't even glance at it. In the Concorde's mobile diplomatic station, 3 ambassadors watched the feed in total silence. Ambassador Vale of the Scythene finally spoke. "There, smiling," she said. "Their ships are destroyed," said Ambassador Goran of the Velhari, pulling up structural analysis data. "Hull integrity on 40% of that fleet is below combat threshold. They should be in dry dock." "And yet here they are," said the third ambassador, an ancient, slow-speaking Duran named Esoth who had been doing this job for 90 years. He leaned forward, studying Admiral Chen's face on the screen with the focused attention of someone reading a very important document. "Greeting us, casually, with a broken fleet, after a war." "Against whom?" Vale asked. Esoth pulled up everything the probe had gathered on the way in. Military engagements, casualty reports, system by system battle records against something called the Kreth Dominion. He read in silence for a long time. "The Kreth," he said finally, "fielded 12,000 warships." The other 2 looked at him. "Humanity defeated them," Esoth continued, his old voice carrying a strange new weight, "in 4 years. He set the data tablet down slowly. With this fleet." None of them said anything. Outside the viewport, Admiral Chen had finished her welcome message and was now laughing at something one of her crew had said, the sound of it bright and completely unbothered, while debris from a dead empire drifted silently past her window. The Concorde's official intelligence file on humanity was opened that day. Under military classification, a junior analyst typed, "Minor regional power. Estimated fleet capacity, 400-500 vessels." Esoth, reading over the analyst's shoulder, said nothing. But he did not sleep well that night. Or the night after. He kept thinking about that smile. That completely, utterly relaxed smile on the face of a woman who had just finished destroying a civilization 12 times her size, and who looked, For all the galaxy, like she was simply waiting to see what interesting thing would happen next. That was the first mistake the Conquered ever made about humanity. It would not be the last. And unlike most mistakes made among the stars, this one would not be forgotten. It would be studied, argued over, and whispered about in war colleges across 17 species for the next 300 years. The moment an entire galactic civilization looked at humanity and saw only what humanity chose to show them, not what humanity actually was. The stars, ancient and indifferent, kept watching. For the first time in a long while, they seemed almost curious. 6 months after first contact, humanity was the talk of the Conquered. Not because they were powerful, the Conquered had seen powerful. Not because they were ambitious, the galaxy was full of ambition. They were talked about because they were strange. They smiled too much. They named their warships things like Stubborn Hope and Last Warning and Please Don't Make Us Do This. They sent diplomatic communiques that were simultaneously warm and faintly, unsettlingly confident, like messages from someone who genuinely liked you, but also knew exactly how many ways they could rearrange your molecules if the conversation went badly. The Velhari hegemony decided this confidence was a bluff. The Velhari were not cruel beings, not exactly. They were pragmatic. They had built their civilization on a simple philosophy: strength is respected, weakness is exploited, and the only way to know which category someone falls into is to push them. They had done this to 12 species over 4 centuries. 8 had folded. 3 had become valuable allies. 1 had fought back hard enough to earn a permanent border and mutual silence. They looked at humanity's 400-ship fleet, their battered hulls, their strange names and stranger smiles, and they calculated. The helium-3 moons of Tau Ceti were technically in disputed space, one of those convenient legal gray areas that the Velhari had learned to use like a scalpel. They filed a navigational claim, dispatched 600 warships under Admiral Thesson, a methodical, experienced commander who had run 6 of these operations before, and began their advance. Thesson expected one of 3 responses: diplomacy, which he would drag out while securing the moons; withdrawal, which would give him everything immediately; or a measured military response that he could outgun and then negotiate from a position of strength. He got none of these. For the first 48 hours, nothing, silence, not even a diplomatic protest. Thesson's ships moved deeper toward Tau Ceti and humanity simply watched. His intelligence officers read this as fear. He read it as inexperience. He increased speed. Then, on hour 71, his proximity sensors lit up. 200 human ships dropped out of FTL, not from one direction, from 3, simultaneously, positioned at exact angles that Thesson realized with a cold, creeping horror had already cut off his retreat vectors. He had not seen them coming because they had not been coming, they had been waiting, prepositioned, days ago, before his fleet had even crossed the border. They knew he was coming before he came. The human fleet spoke first. A single type beam message to his flagship, text only from the local sector commander. It read, "Admiral Thesson, you've made a wrong turn. We're happy to help you find your way back. Please respond within 10 minutes. Commodore Diana Reyes, CNS 7th Patrol Wing." 10 minutes, not a threat, a courtesy. Thesson looked at his tactical display. His 600 ships were larger, yes. Better individually armored, possibly. But they were bunched in a transit formation, not a combat formation. And the human ships were already in firing solutions that his own weapons officers couldn't replicate without 15 minutes of repositioning. 15 minutes he suspected he would not be given if he tried. He called for a ceasefire. The negotiation happened the next day in a neutral station. The Velhari delegation arrived with lawyers, trade economists, and 3 backup arguments about historical navigational rights in the Tau Ceti corridor. The human delegation arrived with 1 man. His name was Marcus Webb. He was a deputy trade envoy. He was eating a sandwich when they walked in, something dense and unglamorous on thick bread, and he did not put it down when they sat across from him. He listened to their opening argument for about 4 minutes, nodded politely, and then said, "Right, so Tau Ceti's ours, that's not really up for debate. The moons stay ours. You can have refueling rights at Station 7 for a reasonable fee, which I think is probably what you actually wanted anyway." He took another bite. "Did you want to run the other argument, or can we write this up and all go home?" The Velhari chief negotiator, who had prepared extensively and was deeply offended, opened his mouth. "You're welcome to try again," Webb said, not unkindly. "I've got another sandwich." The treaty was signed in 40 minutes. Back at Concord Intelligence, the file on humanity was updated. Someone argued for upgrading them to moderate regional power. A junior analyst named Quoreth, a Scythian with large golden eyes and an uncomfortable habit of noticing things others didn't, raised her hand and asked a question. Where did the other 200 ships come from? Everyone looked at her. "The 400 ships we cataloged," she said carefully, pulling up the sensor records. "We have them all accounted for patrols, diplomatic escort, repair docks. So where did these 200 come from?" She turned the display to face the room. "These aren't the same ships, different hull signatures, different weapon configurations, different design generation." She paused. "These ships are newer than anything we've seen from them." A senior admiral waved a hand. "Reserve fleet, every civilization has them." "Yes," Quoreth agreed, "but reserves take time to mobilize. These were prepositioned before Thesson crossed the border." She looked around the room. "They knew, they planned, and they did it with ships we've never seen before from a fleet pool we didn't know existed." The room was quiet for a moment. Then the admiral said, "Update the file, moderate regional power," and closed the meeting. Quoreth walked back to her desk, sat down, and opened a new personal file. She titled it, "What We Don't Know About Humanity." She began to fill it in. She was going to need a lot more pages. Quoreth did not sleep well. This was not new. She had never been a good sleeper, too many thoughts, too many threads that refused to stop pulling at 3 in the morning when the station went quiet, and the only sound was the hum of life support and the soft pinging of her data terminal demanding attention. But in the weeks following the Tau Ceti incident, the sleeplessness had taken on a different quality. It wasn't restless. It was focused. The kind of wakefulness that comes not from anxiety, but from the creeping, bone-deep sense that you are standing very close to something enormous and invisible, and that if you just move slightly to the left, you will finally see it. She moved to the left. It started with the Kreth War. The Kreth Dominion had been a major galactic power before humanity's emergence. Not Concord level, but significant, spanning 19 star systems, with a fleet of approximately 12,000 combat vessels built for aggressive expansion. They had been pushing outward for decades, absorbing smaller species, and the Concord had been watching them with quiet concern. They were, in the intelligence community's professional estimation, probably 15 years away from becoming a genuine problem. Then humanity showed up. The Kreth apparently had the same idea the Velhari later had, that humanity's newly spacefaring civilization, raw and unpolished, would be an easy acquisition. They had been wrong. The war lasted 4 years. At the end of it, the Kreth Dominion did not exist anymore. Not defeated, not occupied, gone. Humanity had not annexed their territory. They'd simply dismantled the military, dissolved the government structure, and left the Kreth people to rebuild themselves without an expansionist ruling class. Clean, surgical, permanent. Quoreth had read the broad strokes of this before. What she hadn't done, what she realized with some embarrassment nobody had done, was look at the actual battle records and count. She counted now. The Kreth had engaged humanity across 31 star systems over 48 months. Their fleet had peaked at 12,400 vessels. In the final accounting, 11,900 of those vessels had been destroyed, disabled, or captured. The remaining 500 had surrendered in the last week of the war. Humanity's losses, 2,200 vessels. Quoreth stared at the number. 2,200 ships destroyed, against a 12,000 ship empire, in 4 years, and humanity had won. That was not a small loss. That was not even a moderate loss. That was the kind of attrition that should have crippled a 400-ship civilization, would have, if humanity's fleet had actually been 400 ships. She pulled the battle records and started cross-referencing hull signatures. The first 200 records took her 3 hours. She identified 847 unique vessels. She went back and checked again, opened a separate verification protocol and ran it twice. 847 unique ships in just the first 200 engagement records. She kept going. She ran the analysis through the night, through the next day, through another night with a brief 4-hour collapse on the cot she kept in her office for exactly this category of emergency. When she finally finished, she sat very still for a long time and looked at the number on her screen. Unique hull signatures identified across all Kreth War combat records, 9,341. 9,341 ships, minimum, because some battles had incomplete sensor records and the number was almost certainly higher. This was not a 400-ship civilization. This was not a 600-ship civilization. This was something else entirely, something the conquered had been looking at for months and simply hadn't seen, because they had never thought to look past the polished, carefully curated face humanity chose to show them. The diplomatic fleet, the patrol fleet, the battered, smiling, sandwich-eating, thoroughly unbothered public face of a civilization that had apparently, quietly, without telling anyone, fielded nearly 10,000 ships in a war, and then parked them somewhere and shrugged. Quareth wrote her report in 2 hours. It was precise, documented, cross-referenced, and absolutely unambiguous. She titled it, Significant Underestimation of Human Military Capacity, Urgent Reassessment Required. She flagged it Priority 1 and sent it to all 3 senior admirals simultaneously. Admiral Keth responded in 4 minutes. Analytical overreach. Hull signature methodology is unreliable across species. Dismissed. Admiral Sorvan responded in 9 minutes. Interesting but inconclusive. Keep monitoring. Admiral Bresch didn't respond at all, which meant he had either not read it or had read it and decided he'd rather not think about it. Quareth looked at the responses for a long time. Then she looked at her data. Then she did something she had never done in 11 years of intelligence work. She opened a second personal file. She titled it, What Happens to Us If I'm Right and They're Not Listening. She left it empty for now. She hoped it would stay that way. But Quareth, more than almost anyone in the Conquered, had a profound gift for understanding when hope and probability were pointed in completely opposite directions. She started sleeping at her desk, just in case she needed to move fast. The message came on a Wednesday at 3:40 station time, when the Concord's diplomatic center was staffed only by the night crew, young, mostly junior officers who had drawn the short straw and were sustaining themselves on bad coffee, and the quiet hope that nothing interesting would happen until their shift ended. Something interesting happened. The transmission was addressed to the full Concord War Council, marked Urgent Active Combat Situation, and it came with a data package so large that the receiving system flagged it as a potential cyberattack and spent 40 seconds verifying it was just. A lot of files. Battle records, system maps, casualty projections, enemy behavioral analyses, material stress assessments, and a covered document with a header that read simply, We need help. The night shift duty officer, a young Velhari named Sarin who had never dealt with anything more serious than a misrouted supply manifest, stared at the transmission for a long moment. Then he woke up his supervisor. His supervisor woke up her supervisor. By 500, the War Council was assembling in the main chamber, most of them still visibly in the process of becoming fully awake, several clutching the Concord equivalent of coffee with both hands. The human representative was already on screen. Her name was General Amara Osai. She was perhaps 50, with a shaved head, sharp eyes, and the bearing of someone who had spent so long in command that authority had ceased to be a posture and had simply become the shape of her. She looked tired. Not frightened, not even close to frightened, but genuinely, comprehensively tired, the way a person looks when they have been running very hard for a very long time and have decided that asking for help is simply the most efficient use of remaining energy. "Thank you for assembling quickly," she said. "I'll be direct. 8 months ago, humanity made contact with a new threat in the Outer Rim. We're calling them the Devouring Choir. They are a hive mind of extragalactic origin, and based on 8 months of engagement data, which you'll find in the attached package, we assess them as an extinction-level threat to every biological civilization in this galaxy, including yours." The War Council chamber was very quiet. "We have been engaging them alone," Osai continued, "across 43 star systems simultaneously for those 8 months. We have stopped their advance. We have not stopped them. They replace losses faster than we can inflict them, and they are learning. We are asking the Conquered to open a second front in the Canny's minor approach vectors while we continue primary engagement in the Outer Rim." Grand Admiral Verk, the Conquered's senior military commander, a hulking, silver-furred Duran who had led 17 campaigns in his career, leaned forward. "General, before we discuss the tactical proposal, this data package, 43 systems, simultaneous engagement. That's," he paused, consulting the figures being relayed to him by his own analysts in real time. His expression shifted into something that was not quite comprehension and not quite the absence of it, but some new uncomfortable territory in between. "That's an extraordinary operational footprint. The assets required to maintain that kind of engagement across that geographic spread would represent." He stopped again. One of his analysts leaned over and whispered something in his ear. Verk sat back slowly. "How many ships do you have?" he asked. The question fell into the room and landed like something heavy. Everyone heard the weight in it, not the routine logistical inquiry it would normally be, but something more naked than that. A question that had been orbiting this council for months without ever quite being spoken aloud. Osai looked at him. Her expression didn't change. She had the face of someone who had been asked this before, or who had been waiting to be asked it, which was somehow more unsettling. "Enough," she said. "The question is whether you're coming and how fast." Verk held her gaze. "General, with respect, we are being asked to commit our Grand Armada to an engagement against an enemy we have only just learned exists, in support of a civilization whose full military capabilities we," he chose his next word carefully, "do not fully understand. I need more than enough." "See what you need to see when we're in the field together," Os said without heat. "I'm not being coy with you, Admiral, I'm being practical. The Choir doesn't care how many ships I have. They care how many they can destroy before they reach your worlds." She leaned forward slightly. "So I'll ask one more time and then I need to get back to my command. 43 systems, Admiral, 8 months, and we haven't lost a single one." She let that sit for exactly 3 seconds. "Are you in or not?" The War Council deliberated for 6 hours. In the intelligence section, 3 floors down, Quareth had been awake since the transmission arrived. She was reading the attached data package. She had been reading it for 3 hours. She was on her 4th cup of something she had long since stopped tasting. The battle records were extraordinary, not just in scale, in quality. The tactical documentation was precise to a degree she had never seen from any species. Every engagement annotated, every decision tree logged, every loss analyzed and integrated into subsequent operations. 8 months of war, and the strategic picture was so clear, so thorough, so organized that it read less like a combat record and more like a controlled experiment. As if humanity had been studying the Choir as much as fighting them. But it was a footnote in the resource allocation report that made Quareth set down her cup and press both palms flat against her desk. It was a single line, buried in a section about fleet resupply logistics. It read, "Note, the following projections assume continued partial mobilization status. Full mobilization protocols remained suspended pending council authorization. Partial mobilization. They were doing all of this, 43 systems, 8 months, a hive mind of extragalactic origin at partial mobilization. Quareth opened her second personal file, the empty one, the one she'd titled What Happens to Us If I'm Right. She started filling it in. The Grand Armada had not assembled in 60 years. It was, by any measure that mattered, an awe-inspiring thing. 4,000 warships drawn from 17 civilizations, each contributing their finest vessels, their most experienced crews, their most advanced weapons systems. The Scythian brought their mirror-hulled interceptors, blinding in starlight. The Duran contributed their legendary dreadnoughts, city-sized and ancient, their hulls carved with the names of every battle they had survived. The Velhari sent their strike carriers, lean and fast and bristling with fighter bays. Even species who had not fought a war in living memory contributed, because what General Osai had shown the Council was not a regional conflict. It was a preview of something much worse, and everyone with functioning survival instincts understood that. Grand Admiral Verk stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Eternal Compact, and watched his assembled fleet on the tactical display and felt, for perhaps the first time in his long career, something close to genuine pride. This, he thought, is what civilization looks like when it chooses to stand together. 4,000 ships, the greatest fleet in conquered history. More than enough, surely more than enough for whatever lay ahead. The rally point was a cold, dark region at the fringe of the Canis Minor dwarf galaxy's outer arm designated coordinate Sigma 9, a system with no habitable worlds, no resources, nothing to recommend it except location. It was equidistant from the Choir's current advance vectors and humanities listed engagement theaters. A good place to meet. A good place to plan. The Eternal Compact dropped out of FTL first. Standard protocol, the lead ship always arrives first and confirms the rally point is secure. The sensors swept the system. And then every alarm aboard the Eternal Compact fired simultaneously. Not threat alarms, contact alarms. The difference was meaningful and in this moment did nothing to slow Verk's heart rate, because contact alarms were firing in a pattern he had never seen in his 60 years of command, not a sequence, not a cascade, but a simultaneous, system-wide saturation that meant the sensors had encountered more objects than they had been designed to individually track and had simply given up and reported. Many. Report, Verk said, very calmly because he was a professional. His sensor officer, LT, Commander Ish, looked at her display, looked at it again, tapped it with one finger as if physical contact might correct whatever error she was clearly experiencing. Her mouth moved without sound for a moment. Then she said, "Admiral, I'm reading. 14,200 and..." She stopped. 14,247 vessels, human configuration, already in formation. She looked up. They were here before us, sir, all of them. The rest of the conquered fleet was dropping out of FTL now, 2 and 3 ships at a time, filling the system with the familiar shapes of allies and the enormity of 4,000 hulls. It was a staggering fleet by any historical measure. It looked, in the shadow of what was already here, almost modest. 14,000 human warships, not the battered diplomatic craft of first contact, not the sleek patrol vessels of the Tau Ceti response. These were purpose-built war machines, deep-hulled dreadnoughts alongside agile destroyer screens, alongside carrier groups of a scale the conquered had no classification for. They were organized in a layered formation so geometrically precise that Verk's tactical officers kept second-guessing their own instruments, because no fleet this large should be capable of that kind of formation discipline. A small shuttle departed the human fleet and docked with the Eternal Compact 20 minutes later. The woman who stepped out was not General Osai. She was younger, perhaps 35, with the easy, unhurried movements of someone completely comfortable in large ships and tense rooms. She introduced herself as Commander Lena Park, Logistics and Coordination, Theater Command 6. Theater Command 6, Verk repeated. Yes, sir. This is one theater. Yes, sir. How many theaters are there? Park thought for a moment with the expression of someone doing simple arithmetic. 12 active, 4 standing by. Somewhere at the back of the bridge, someone from the Velhari delegation made a very small sound. Not a word, just a sound. The kind that happens when the body processes something before the mind is ready to. Ver kept his face completely still with the practiced discipline of a 6-decade military career. And the other theaters, he said carefully, they're engaged. Yes, sir. Theater commands 1 through 5 and 7 through 12 are maintaining current engagement lines against the choir. Theater 6 was designated for joint operations with the Concord. She smiled, that same smile Verk had seen in the first contact footage, the one that was warm and genuine, and radiated an absolute baseline certainty that was more unsettling than any threat could be. We thought 14,000 was a reasonable contribution for an introductory operation. Introductory. Grand Admiral Verk, who had sailed through the cores of stars, who had negotiated treaties with hive minds and directed battles across planetary systems, who had seen more of the galaxy's capacity for violence than almost any living being, looked at Commander Lena Park and had a very specific, very clear thought. We have been looking at the surface of this civilization for a year. We have not seen the bottom yet. We don't know if there is one. Very good, Commander, he said. Let's discuss operational plans. Behind him, very quietly, someone from the Velhari flagship uplink threw up. Verk chose not to acknowledge it. Some moments deserved a certain dignity. The first engagement happened 3 days after the Rally Point Assembly, in a system the Concord charts called Fringe 7, and humanity's operational maps labeled, with their characteristic peculiarity, Tuesday. The devouring choir was not what the Concord expected. Prepared intellectually for a hive mind. It studied the xenological briefings, reviewed the content reports, absorbed the psychological profile. They understood in the abstract clinical sense. Hive mind was a distributed intelligence, no individual components possessing full sentience, operating with collective efficiency, and without the vulnerability of individual decision-making. They knew this. Knowing it, not seeing it anything less than deep, viscerally horrible. The choir moved like a single organism, 800 vessels entering the Fringe 7 system in a flowing, coordinated mass that shifted and adapted like a school of fish shifts around an obstacle, except the obstacle in this case was weapons fire, which were warships, and the whole thing operated on a reaction time that should have been physically impossible for objects to math. There was no communication lag, no command hierarchy to interrupt, no flight target. Destroying individuals slowed them because there was no individual destroying, just the whole temporarily smaller. The Congress fleet watched this on their tactical screens from the edge of the system, where humanity had, with polite firmness, positioned them, and several senior commanders began drafting contingency retreat plans. Then the humans moved. It was hard to describe afterward, and Concord officers would spend years trying. Like watching a machine, some said. Like watching a mind, said others. Both were right and both were incomplete. What humanity did in the next 11 minutes was not merely tactical, it was architectural. They didn't engage the choir directly. They reshaped the space the choir was fighting in. Destroyer screens fanned outward faster than anything that size should have moved, not to attack, but to define a perimeter, invisible walls of fire coverage that herded the choir's fluid formation into a specific channel. Carrier groups released fighter wings in patterns that forced the choir to commit to a heading. 3 dreadnought columns, which had appeared to be positioning for a direct engagement, stopped short and simply stood there, creating a wall the choir couldn't ignore without exposing a flank. The choir adapted. The choir always adapted. But adaptation takes a fraction of a second, and humanity had clearly spent 8 months cataloging exactly how the choir adapted, because every countermove the choir made had been anticipated and accounted for 2 moves ahead. They were not fighting the battle in front of them. They were fighting the battle they had already modeled, down to the decision branches, and all they were doing now was confirming their predictions. 11 minutes after first contact, the 800-vessel choir force had been divided into 3 isolated segments, each unable to support the others, each facing a human kill group optimized specifically for a target of that size and configuration. The Conquered had been used as the net, positioned at the exit vectors, told to hold position and destroy anything that tried to break through. Nothing broke through. The battle was over in 11 minutes. Grand Admiral Verk stood on his bridge and stared at the tactical replay for a long time. The thing that struck him was not the efficiency. It was the calm. No panicked orders. No improvisation. Human command communication during the engagement had been so sparse that the Conquered Signals Intelligence team had initially thought their intercept equipment was malfunctioning. What they were hearing was not a battle being commanded. It was a plan being executed. The difference, Verk had learned today, was everything. In the debrief, Verk asked Commander Park about the Operation Naming conventions. They were in a briefing room aboard the Eternal Compact, surrounded by holographic replays and a truly extraordinary amount of human documentation, because humanity, it turned out, documented everything. Every decision, every variable, every alternative course considered and discarded. Verk had reviewed the pre-battle operation plan out of professional curiosity and found it went to 17 appendices. Operation Gentle Reminder, he said, pointing to the header on the Fringe 7 file. What does that mean? Park glanced at it. The choir had probed this system 4 times in the past 3 weeks. We needed to communicate that the probe and retreat approach wasn't going to be viable anymore. She said it the way one might explain a perfectly straightforward thing. So, gentle reminder. Verk looked at the file for the next scheduled operation. Project Bedtime, he read aloud. Choir has a cluster formation pattern they use for what we believe is a regeneration cycle. They go into a lower activity state for roughly 6 hours. We're going to catch the next one mid-cycle. She paused. It seemed fitting. Verk decided not to ask about the one after that, which was titled Operation. We asked nicely. He wasn't sure he was ready. What he was ready for, what he could not avoid, was the larger picture assembling itself around him, operation by operation, engagement by engagement. Humanity didn't just fight. Humanity prepared to fight at a level of investment and depth that made the Conquered's best battle planning look like roughed-out sketches by comparison. Their psychological warfare division, a thing Verk had not known existed until it was mentioned in the appendix of a logistics report, had been running choir behavioral modification experiments for 6 months, trying to introduce exploitable patterns into the hive mind's decision-making at the cost of immense resources and no guaranteed payoff. Their supply chain extended back across 50 light-years in pre-positioned caches that had been placed before the first engagement, on the assumption that a long campaign would follow. Their crew rotation schedule, strict 18-hour cycles, no exceptions, with mandatory rest enforced at the software level so commanders couldn't override it, had been designed by behavioral psychologists after studying historical human performance degradation data going back 300 years. They had thought about everything. Not because they were pessimists, not because they expected to lose, but because somewhere in the deep architecture of human civilization, apparently, there existed a categorical belief that the difference between victory and catastrophe was almost always, in the end, preparation, and that there was no such thing as too much of it. Verk thought about that for a long time. Then he requested a full copy of Humanity's Operational Planning Manual. It was 4,000 pages long. He started reading that night. By page 200, he had stopped being surprised and started taking notes. The treaty came at the end of what humanity called the Fringe Campaign and the Conquered, with somewhat more drama, called the War of Choir Suppression. It was not the end of the choir. Nobody was confident enough in their understanding of an extragalactic hive mind to declare that, but it was the end of the choir's advance. 17 systems reclaimed. the choir's forward elements scattered. Their ability to project coordinated force into this galaxy, at minimum, severely disrupted. It was a victory. A genuine, unambiguous, exhausting victory, and even the most reserved members of the conquered War Council permitted themselves something resembling relief when the last battle report came in. In the treaty negotiations that followed, humanity's position was straightforward: formal alliance, mutual defense obligations, shared intelligence infrastructure, and full military disclosure as a condition of alliance membership. The conquered agreed to all of it. In exchange, humanity agreed to share its operational doctrine, which, based on 6 weeks of joint operations, approximately every military commander in the conquered fleet had already requested on an individual basis anyway. The full military disclosure document arrived at conquered intelligence headquarters on a morning that would later be described by every officer present as, in some way, life-changing. It was not a dramatic document. That was almost the worst part. It was thoroughly bureaucratic, organized, tabulated, cross-referenced, delivered in the standard alliance treaty format as if it were a routine submission rather than a complete restructuring of the Conquered's understanding of galactic power dynamics. It had section headers and footnotes and a very thorough table of contents. Quareth had been waiting for it for 11 months. She had been waiting for it since the night she found the hull's signature data. She read it the moment it cleared decryption, at 6:11 station time, in her office, with a fresh cup of something warm and her second personal file open beside her, both of them finally about to receive answers. She read the first section, active standing fleet, 42,000 vessels. She stopped, reread the number. It did not change. Section 2, fleet commands, 8 regional fleet commands, each comprising between 14,000 and 22,000 vessels, with full logistical independence. The theater system she'd seen in the Fringe campaign, 12 active theaters, was below the structural fleet command. Theaters were deployed from fleet command. A fleet command could support multiple simultaneous theater-level operations. And 3. Reserve capacity. Human civilian starships, cargo haulers, ships, long-range transport vessels, were designed to model with military conversion compatibility. The document cited of a single manufacturing hub having converted 400 civilian vessels to combat configuration in a 3-week period during the Kreth War, at no interruption to civilian operations. Estimated total reserve capacity, in 6 months' notice and full mobilization, somewhere between 3 and 7 million vessels, depending on the definition of combat capable. Oreth read that number, 3 to 7 million. She had not missed. There's no decimal point hiding somewhere. It was just the number, sitting there in its plain bureaucratic formatting, unbothered by its own implications. Section 4, mobilization status. She found the footnote. She found a version of it before, buried in the campaign logistics files, the casual reference to partial mobilization. But this was the official treaty disclosure, and it was precise where the footnote had been vague. Current mobilization status, 18% of authorized wartime capacity. The Fringe campaign had been conducted at 18% mobilization. The Kreth War, according to the historical data in the appendix, had peaked at 22%. Humanity had never gone above 22%. Not in the Kreth War, not against the choir. The full mobilization authorization, every fleet command, every reserve, the full 7 million vessel potential, had never been invoked. There was a specific section explaining the authorization process required to invoke it. It involved the Terran Allied Systems Council, 3 separate executive bodies, and a protocol that, per the document, had been designed to be difficult to trigger, because the humans had apparently decided, at some constitutional level, that a civilization capable of full mobilization probably needed strong structural reasons not to do it easily. The document also contained, in a dry appendix, a brief historical note, Full mobilization had been requested twice in recorded history. Both requests had been denied. The Concord's analysts, reading this hours later, would argue about what those two threats could possibly have been, threats serious enough to prompt the request, and yet ultimately handled without it. Quoreth closed the document. She sat with her hands flat on her desk and breathed carefully and looked at nothing in particular. Then she called her supervisor. "You need to read the disclosure," she said. "I'm scheduled to review it this afternoon." Now Quoreth said, "Read it now." Her supervisor read it. He called his supervisor. That supervisor called the director. By 900, the entire Concord Intelligence Directorate was in emergency closed session. The document projected wall to wall, every analyst in the building cycling through the sections with the universal expression of people discovering that the map they've been using doesn't match the territory. That it has, in fact, never matched the territory, and the territory is considerably larger and more complicated and more patient than anything the map suggested. At some point, Admiral Verk arrived. He stood at the back of the room and read the mobilization status figure in silence. Then he said, to no one in particular, 18%, and then nothing else for a very long time. Quoreth opened her second file, the one she'd been filling in for 11 months, cataloging the questions, the anomalies, the moments when the numbers didn't add up and nobody wanted to hear about it. She read through it once from start to finish. Then she closed it. The file was no longer necessary. She understood now. She understood everything. And understanding it did not feel like triumph. It felt like standing at the edge of a very large, very deep, very calm ocean. One that had been there the whole time, that had never threatened her, that was by all indications entirely peaceful, and realizing with total clarity that she had spent a year calling it a lake. She requested 3 weeks of personal leave. Her request was approved within the hour. She suspected her supervisor had also requested leave. She suspected a lot of people were about to. The ceremony was held on neutral ground. Not a Concord station, not a human installation. The venue was a place called the Threshold, a centuries-old meeting point built by a species that no longer existed, a vast, cold, beautiful structure of pale stone and open arches floating in the space between two galaxies, where the dark between stars was deepest and the sense of distance from everything was absolute. It was a place built for moments that were supposed to outlast the people who made them. 17 species attended. Every Concord member sent representatives, military commanders, heads of state, senior diplomats, cultural ambassadors. The Velhari delegation, notably, included Admiral Thesson, who had been recalled from a quiet retirement posting for the occasion, and who stood in the third row with the expression of a man who had spent 6 months thinking about a very bad decision and had arrived at a thorough peace with it. The Scythian brought Esoth, ancient, slow-moving, amber-eyed Esoth, who had been the first Concord representative to meet Admiral Chen at first contact, and who had, it would later be said, understood more in those first 5 minutes than the rest of the Concord had understood in a year. Humanity sent Admiral Yara Chen. She was 50 now. The scar that had appeared somewhere in the Fringe campaign traced a pale line from her left jaw to her cheekbone, a thin, unremarkable thing that she wore with the same disregard she wore most things, as simply part of the landscape of herself, deserving no particular attention. She stood at the ceremony in the dress uniform of the Consolidated Human Navy, which was elegant without being ornate, dark with narrow silver trim, bearing 17 commendations in a column over her left breast and a small gold pin at her collar that Quoreth, who had spent considerable time researching human military insignia, recognized as the mark of the 7th Fleet Command. The theater that had never once been deployed and that existed, as best anyone could tell, purely as contingency. The Grand Speaker of the Concord, a Durin named Varaz, gave the formal address. He spoke well, the Durin always spoke well, their voices deep and deliberate and built for weight. He spoke of sacrifice and solidarity and the understanding, hard one, that no civilization survives its worst moments alone. He acknowledged the choir's defeat. He acknowledged the courage of the joint fleet. He paused, as speakers pause at these moments, to let silence do the work that words cannot. Then he looked at Yara Chen. "There is a question," he said, "that this alliance has been asking since before it existed, since the first probe, since the first contact. It has been asked in intelligence files and strategy meetings and long sleepless nights by analysts trying to understand what they were looking at." He paused. "I would like to ask it now, properly, formally, to you." He held her gaze. "Why didn't you tell us what you were?" The chamber was absolutely still. Chen stood with her hands clasped loosely behind her back and her weight on one foot, and that particular quality of attention she always had, not searching, not calculating, but genuinely present, as if this specific moment had her full investment and nothing about it was beneath notice. She was quiet for a moment. Not the quietness of someone forming a careful diplomatic response, just thinking, the way you think about something you actually want to answer honestly. "When did you realize your star was one of billions?" she asked. Varaz looked at her. "Excuse me. Your species. When did you learn, really learn, not just as a fact but as something you felt, that your sun was one star among hundreds of billions in this galaxy alone, and that the galaxy was one of hundreds of billions in the observable universe?" She looked around the chamber at 17 species, all watching her. "Do you remember that moment, when the scale of it actually landed?" Silence. Several delegates exchanged glances. "We do," Chen said. "Humans. We have records of the exact historical moment the math became real to us, not just theoretical but emotionally real. And you know what most people felt?" She let a breath out slowly. "Not small. Most people felt relieved. Like the pressure of being alone with all our problems was suddenly distributed across something so vast that the problems themselves shrank into proportion." She paused. "That's what we are. That's what we've always been. We're not a 400-ship civilization pretending to be larger. We're not a threat wearing a diplomatic smile. We are exactly what you've seen for the past year, people who like meeting other people, who will help when asked, who don't start fights and end every fight they're dragged into, who name their warships things that would probably embarrass most other species." She smiled. And there it was, the same smile from the first contact footage, unchanged by years and wars and scars. "We didn't tell you what we were because we don't think about it the way you're thinking about it right now. You're looking at fleet numbers. We're looking at whether this alliance is going to hold together well enough to face what comes next." A murmur ran through the chamber. The words "what comes next" had a specific gravity in a room where everyone had spent the last 6 months fighting an extragalactic hive mind. "There's something after the choir," Varaz asked quietly. "There's always something after," Chen said, simply, completely without drama. "That's been true for every civilization in this room. We've just had a bit more time to prepare for it." She looked at the treaty document on the podium between them, the signed, sealed thing that made the alliance official. "Which is why we need this. Not because we need you to fight. We need you because a war that 17 civilizations believe in is a war that means something. And meaning something is how you make sure you're still here to win the next one." The chamber was quiet for a long, full moment. Varaz looked at her for a long time. Then he looked at the treaty. Then he looked at the room, at Esoth, who was nodding with the slow inevitability of a man whose oldest suspicions had just been confirmed. At Admiral Verk, who was staring at the floor with the expression of someone filing several professional lessons away simultaneously. At Quorath, who was perfectly, absolutely still, watching Chen with an expression that was something between relief and wonder, and the specific peace that comes from a mystery finally resolving. "Then let's make sure it means something," Varaz said. He signed the treaty. 17 civilizations signed it. And Yara Chen signed it last, with a regular pen, which a Velhari junior diplomat later quietly pocketed as a historical artifact. Because by then, everybody understood, with the full clarity of people who had finally seen the bottom of the ocean, that they were living inside a story that would be told for 1,000 years. Outside the threshold, in the deep dark between galaxies, the stars continued their ancient, indifferent burning. They had, everyone agreed, grown slightly more interested recently. Humanity had that effect. And